On the 1st of October, 1949, a man stood on the balcony of the Tiananmen Gate in Beijing and declared the founding of the People's Republic of China. Mao Zedong's exact words, heard by hundreds of thousands gathered in the great square below, were,
中国人民站起来了.
The Chinese people have stood up. The crowd's response made the square shudder. Behind those 6 words lay 5,000 years of civilization, wars, dynasties, empires, and catastrophes, and 1 century of what the Chinese would come to call their greatest humiliation. What had brought this country, this astonishing, ancient, endlessly layered country, to this particular moment? The answer begins beside a river. Welcome to Arthur's living history. From the oracle bones of the Shang kings to the Terracotta Army of the first emperor, from the silk roads of the Han to the gunpowder of the Song. How does one civilization sustain itself across 5,000 years of change, catastrophe, and renewal? Let me take you through it. The Chinese call the Yellow River their mother river, the Huanghe, yellow from the lowest soil it carries from the high plateaus, floods its banks with destructive regularity, and deposits the rich silt that makes the surrounding land among the most fertile in East Asia. Farming communities had established themselves along its middle and lower courses by around 5000 BCE, and burying their dead with pottery and jade objects. By 2000 BCE, these communities had begun coalescing into something larger, and the first shadows of organized political authority were falling across the Yellow River Plain. The Shang Dynasty, which can be confirmed with certainty from around 1600 BCE, left behind both the most impressive bronze vessels of the Bronze Age world and something far more remarkable: writing, oracle bones, the shoulder blades of cattle and the shells of tortoises, inscribed with questions posed to royal ancestors and then heated until they cracked. The cracks, interpreted as answers, bear the oldest Chinese script ever found. Here is what makes those bones astonishing across 3,500 years. The symbols on them are the recognizable ancestors of the characters used to write Chinese today. The script has evolved, but the continuity has never been broken. A person who can read a modern Chinese newspaper can learn, with modest effort, to recognize the hand of a Shang diviner reaching across 35 centuries. The script is not phonetic. It does not represent sounds the way an alphabet does. It represents meanings, and because meanings change more slowly than pronunciations, the same characters can be read in Cantonese, Mandarin, Japanese, and a dozen other languages, each reader pronouncing the same symbols differently but comprehending the same idea. This is perhaps the single most consequential fact about Chinese civilization. Its written language was, from the very beginning, designed for a world of linguistic diversity, and it has held that world together for 3,500 years. The Zhou dynasty that overthrew the Shang in 1046 BCE introduced an idea that would shape Chinese political philosophy for the next 3,000 years: the mandate of heaven. Rulers governed legitimately only so long as they governed well, and catastrophe was heaven's signal that the mandate had been withdrawn. The framework simultaneously justified revolution and demanded moral governance. The Zhou dynasty endured for nearly 800 years, the longest in Chinese history, but its later centuries were dominated by constant warfare among competing states. That warfare, paradoxically, generated one of the greatest intellectual explosions in human history. Confucius, born around 551 BCE, taught that social harmony depended on proper relationships enacted through ritual and personal virtue, a philosophy that would become the foundational framework of Chinese civilization. Taoism explored the ineffable principle underlying all existence, best approached through simplicity and attunement to nature. And legalism argued that human beings required strong laws and severe punishments to function as a society. These three schools would compete, merge, and interact across 2,000 subsequent years of Chinese thought. What is remarkable about the Zhou period, from a modern vantage point, is that the intellectual achievement was simultaneous with near-constant warfare, as if the chaos itself were generative, forcing the question of how human beings should organize themselves in the most urgent possible terms. The parallel flowering in roughly the same century of Confucius in China, the Buddha in India, Socrates in Greece, and the Hebrew prophets in Israel led the philosopher Karl Jaspers to coin the term Axial Age, for this extraordinary moment when human beings across multiple civilizations, independently and almost simultaneously, turned to systematic philosophical and ethical reflection. China was not peripheral to that transformation. It was one of its centers. It was legalism, wielded with ferocious efficiency by the state of Qin, that ended the Warring States period and created China. In 221 BCE, after conquering the last surviving states in a decade of rapid campaigns, the king of Qin invented a new title for himself, Huangdi, Emperor. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, intended his dynasty to last 10,000 generations. It lasted 15 years, but what he accomplished reshaped everything that followed. He standardized the written language across an empire that spoke dozens of mutually incomprehensible dialects, creating for the first time a written medium through which all literate Chinese could communicate. He standardized weights, measures, coins, and the axle widths of carts. He linked the border walls of the northern states into a single defensive line that was the ancestor of the Great Wall. He did all of this through forced labor and a legal code of savage severity, burning books and burying scholars alive. He died in 210 BCE and was buried near modern Xi'an beneath a mountain-sized complex guarded by 8,000 life-sized terracotta warriors and horses, each individually crafted with distinct features. The complex was rediscovered in 1974 by farmers digging a well and is still only partially excavated. The tomb itself, the inner chamber, sealed under a man-made mountain, has never been opened, in part because ancient accounts describe rivers of liquid mercury flowing through its model of the empire, and modern soil surveys have confirmed extraordinarily high mercury concentrations above it. What lies beneath that hill is one of the great unopened questions in archaeology. The Han Dynasty that followed governed China for 400 years and gave the Chinese people a name they still use for themselves: Han Chinese, Han characters. The Han synthesized legalist administrative structures with Confucian ideology and created a bureaucratic state in which government positions were in principle awarded on merit rather than birth. The beginning of the civil examination system that would eventually become the most sophisticated meritocratic selection process the pre-modern world devised. Emperor Wu expanded the empire westward through Central Asia, establishing the Silk Road, the network of trade routes that carried Chinese silk, paper, and porcelain to Rome, and returned with glassware, horses, and ideas from the Mediterranean. Paper itself was a Han innovation. The historian Sima Qian, working in the 1st century BCE, wrote a comprehensive history of China, from its legendary origins to his own time, that established the template for all subsequent Chinese dynastic histories. China had discovered the art of writing its own past, and it would never stop. This impulse to record and interpret, to situate the present dynasty within a continuous narrative stretching back to the legendary Yellow Emperor, gave Chinese civilization a quality unique in the ancient world, a sense of itself as a single entity persisting through time, rather than a succession of unrelated kingdoms. The concept of China as a unified whole, which required defense and restoration when fragmented, was as much a literary and historical creation as a political one. After the Han's eventual fragmentation, the Sui dynasty briefly reunified China in 581 CE and dug the Grand Canal, a waterway of nearly 1,700 kilometers connecting the Yellow River to the Yangtze, allowing grain from the fertile south to feed the political capitals of the north, an engineering achievement on a par with the Great Wall itself. Under the Tang dynasty that replaced the Sui in 618, China became the most sophisticated civilization on Earth. The Tang capital, Chang'an, a precisely gridded city of some 1 million inhabitants, was the most cosmopolitan metropolis in the world. Persian merchants, Arab traders, Japanese students, Tibetan monks, Nestorian Christian missionaries, and Jewish scholars walked its boulevards alongside Han Chinese. Empress Wu Zetian became China's only female ruler, governing effectively for decades through a combination of political cunning and genuine administrative talent. The Tang was the golden age of Chinese poetry, producing in Li Bai and Du Fu two figures whose work is still recited 14 centuries after their deaths. And woodblock printing was developed under the Tang. The world's oldest surviving printed book, the Diamond Sutra, dates to 868 CE. It transformed the circulation of texts in ways that anticipated the significance of Gutenberg's press in Europe by 6 centuries. The Tang was also the period when Buddhism reached the peak of its influence in China. The monk Xuanzang made a 17-year pilgrimage to India to collect scriptures, translated them with obsessive care on his return, and inspired the greatest novel in Chinese literature, Journey to the West, written 6 centuries after his death. The Tang dynasty fell in 907, consumed by internal rebellion and the collapse of central authority. But it had set a standard of cultural sophistication against which every subsequent Chinese dynasty would measure itself. The Song dynasty that followed produced something historians have debated ever since: a proto-industrial revolution. Song China, in the year 1078, produced more iron than all of Europe combined would produce in 1700. Movable type printing was invented around 1040, 4 centuries before Gutenberg. The world's first paper currency was issued in Sichuan in the early 11th century. The magnetic compass was refined for maritime navigation. Gunpowder, discovered by Tang alchemists, was weaponized by Song military engineers into the world's first bombs, fire lances, and early guns. The Song philosopher Zhou synthesized Confucian ethics with Buddhist metaphysics into a framework that would define educated Chinese thinking for the next 7 centuries. In the great cities of Song China, restaurants, tea houses, and wholesale markets operated around the clock in an urban commercial culture that Europe would not match until the 18th century. Francis Bacon, writing in the 1620s, named printing, gunpowder, and the compass as the 3 inventions that had changed the whole face of the world. All 3 came from China. The Song also produced the most detailed portrait of urban commercial life in any pre-modern civilization: the painting Along the River during the Qing festival, a 12-meter scroll depicting the daily life of Bianjing, the Song capital, with an extraordinary density of boats, markets, workshops, tea houses, and human drama. A panorama of a city of perhaps 1 million people going about its business in the 11th century. It is the closest thing the ancient world produced to a photograph. Then came the Mongols. Kublai Khan completed the conquest of the southern Song in 1279, establishing the Yuan dynasty and making Beijing the capital of the largest contiguous land empire in history. The Pax Mongolica, the peace across the vast Mongol Empire, made overland trade safer than it had been for generations, and goods, ideas, and plague moved between China and Europe with new speed. It was under Kublai Khan that Marco Polo spent 17 years at the Chinese court and returned to describe a civilization so advanced that his European readers assumed he had invented it. He had not. The Yuan dynasty fell in 1368 to a Chinese rebel, a former Buddhist monk named Zhou Yuanzhang, who founded the Ming. The Ming rebuilt the Great Wall into roughly the form it takes today. They built the Forbidden City, the greatest palace complex on Earth, whose vermilion walls and golden rooflines still stand at the center of modern Beijing. And between 1405 and 1433, Admiral Zheng He commanded 7 voyages across the Indian Ocean with fleets of up to 300 vessels, treasure ships over 100 meters long, 4 times the size of Columbus's Santa Maria, reaching Arabia, East Africa, and India. The voyages demonstrated a civilization so confident in its own supremacy, it felt no need to conquer what it could simply impress. Then the Yongle emperor who had championed them died, the voyages were cancelled, the records partly destroyed, and China turned inward, just as the Portuguese were rounding the Cape of Good Hope. The question of what would have happened if Zheng He's voyages had continued is one of history's great what-ifs. China had, in 1430, the technology, the maritime capability, and the sheer scale of population and production to have done what Europe would do over the next 3 centuries. It chose not to. The reasons remain debated: court factionalism, the cost of the expeditions, Confucian suspicion of merchants, and overseas adventure. The consequences are not debated at all. The Qing dynasty, established by Manchu forces from the northeast in 1644, expanded China to its greatest territorial extent, incorporating Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Tibet. Under the Kangxi and Qianlong emperors, Qing China was the world's largest economy by a significant margin, home to some 300 million people, a third of the entire human race. When the British trade mission led by Lord Macartney arrived in 1793 seeking expanded commercial rights, the Qianlong emperor replied to King George III that China possessed all things in abundance and had no need of foreign goods. The confidence was not unjustified, and it was about to be catastrophically disproven. The British East India Company had found that the one commodity Chinese consumers would accept was opium, grown in Bengal. By the 1830s, an estimated 15 million Chinese were addicted to it. When the Qing commissioner Lin Zexu ordered 20,000 chests of British opium destroyed in 1839, Britain sent the Royal Navy. In the First Opium War of 1839 to 1842, Chinese forces armed with matchlock muskets were overwhelmed by British steam warships and modern artillery. The Treaty of Nanjing ceded Hong Kong to Britain, opened 5 ports to foreign trade, and required China to pay an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars. A second Opium War in 1856 to 1860 saw the Summer Palace outside Beijing looted and burned by British and French forces. More ports were opened. Foreigners became immune to Chinese law on Chinese soil. China called what followed the Century of Humiliation, and the name was accurate: the Taiping Rebellion of 1850 to 1864. A catastrophic civil war driven by a charismatic leader who believed himself the younger brother of Jesus Christ, may have killed between 20 and 70 million people, more than any war in history up to that point. Japan defeated China in 1895 and seized Taiwan. Foreign troops marched into Beijing in 1900 after the Boxer Rebellion. In 1911, provincial uprisings cascaded into the collapse of the Qing. The last emperor, Puyi, a child of 6, abdicated in February 1912. 2,000 years of imperial rule were over. What followed was not the modern republic the reformers had hoped for. Sun Yat-sen's new government was almost immediately seized by the military strongman Yuan Shikai. After Yuan's death in 1916, the country fragmented among warlords. The Chinese Communist Party was founded in Shanghai in 1921. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces slaughtered thousands of communists in the Shanghai Massacre of 1927. Mao Zedong led the survivors on the Long March of 1934 to 1935. 6,000 miles through impossible terrain, pursued by nationalist forces, arriving in Shanxi with a shattered remnant. It became the founding myth of the communist movement, the story of a force that should have been destroyed and was not. Of the 85,000 who began the march, perhaps 7,000 to 8,000 completed it. Among those survivors was the political and military leadership that would govern China for the next generation. Japan invaded in earnest in 1937. The Nanjing Massacre in December of that year, in which Japanese forces killed an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners over 6 weeks, was only the most documented atrocity in a war that killed somewhere between 8 and 20 million Chinese before Japan's defeat in 1945. The communists and nationalists resumed their civil war almost immediately afterward. By 1949, Chiang Kai-shek's government had collapsed and fled to Taiwan, and Mao Zedong stood on the gate of heavenly peace. The Chinese people have stood up. The words carried the weight of opium wars and unequal treaties and burning palaces, but also the weight of everything that had come before. The oracle bones and the terracotta warriors, the Silk Road and the Grand Canal, the poems of Du Fu and the innovations of the Song, the treasure fleets that sailed to Africa and were recalled. China had absorbed the Mongols, the Manchu, the British, the Japanese, and remained, in some essential way, itself. Whether the new People's Republic would honor that civilizational continuity or rupture it was a question that 1950 had only just begun to answer. If this 5,000-year journey has left you wanting to know more, then subscribe, because every episode on this channel reaches for exactly that same feeling, the full weight of everything a place has been. I'm Arthur, and I want to know, what historical era or civilization should I explore next? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you in the next chapter.